Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive, this time into a word I bet you hear everywhere these days. Institutions. Like our institutions are under threat or we need to strengthen them or something, but what does it even mean? We're going to try to unpack that today using this really cool book by Paul Seabright. It's called The Company of Strangers.
Yeah, you're right. It's like a term we use all the time, but don't really think about. What's interesting is that Seabright takes us way back to figure out what institutions really are. So imagine this, okay, a 6,000-year-old village in Banpo, China, just a bunch of huts, right? But surrounded by this massive ditch, 5 meters deep.
A ditch that's an institution.
Yeah, I know it might seem kind of strange, but think about it, this ditch, like Seabright says, it wasn't just some random hole in the ground. It shows how these early humans cooperated in a way they hadn't really done before. They had to work together, figure out how to organize themselves to build this thing. And why? Because they lived in a world where violence from outsiders was a constant threat. That ditch, it was an early institution, a sign that they were coming together to protect themselves and all their stuff.
Okay, I see what you're getting at. But if that ditch is an institution, then what does that tell us about institutions today? I mean, we're not exactly digging ditches to keep out invaders, are we?
That's true, but the basic idea is the same institutions are all about cooperation. They're the rules, the norms, the systems we create to live and work together, even with people we don't know at all. And what's crazy is that this large-scale cooperation, like we see in our globalized world, it's actually a pretty new thing in human history. For most of our time on Earth, we lived in small hunter-gatherer groups where trust was based on knowing everyone face to face.
So like you're saying, our brains aren't really wired for this kind of huge cooperation thing.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, Seabright has some pretty intense statistics about this back then. A typical hunter-gatherer had a 14% chance of dying a violent death from another human being. That's 10 times higher than today. So it makes sense that we evolved to be suspicious of strangers.
Wow. Okay. So not trusting strangers is built into our DNA. So how did we go from that to trusting pilots we've never met to fly us across the country, or relying on these complicated financial systems to manage our money?
That's exactly the paradox Seabright talks about. And the answer, he says, is in the institutions we've built, they're like a bridge over this evolutionary gap, allowing us to trust and cooperate on a scale that our ancestors wouldn't even have been able to imagine.
So institutions are like the scaffolding that holds up modern society?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Think of it like this trust is the invisible glue that holds everything together, and institutions are what create and reinforce that trust. They do this by making things predictable, setting clear rules and having ways to enforce those rules and hold people accountable.
So you're saying that even though we might not understand every little detail of how an airplane works or all the complexities of the global financial system, we trust that these systems work because of the institutions behind them.
Exactly. Seabright calls this tunnel vision. We can take part in these complex systems without needing to understand the whole picture because we trust the institutions that run them, we trust that the pilots are trained properly, that the planes are checked regularly, and that the financial markets are regulated so they don't totally collapse.
This tunnel vision thing is really interesting. So in a way, institutions let us be super specialized and efficient because we don't have to worry about every single step in the process, right?
Right. But here's where things get tricky. This tunnel vision can also be kind of dangerous if we rely too much on institutions without understanding how they work or holding them accountable. We become vulnerable to people messing with them. Corruption and systemic failures.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do these institutions actually work? What are they made of?
Seabright gives a really clear definition. Institutions are sets of rules governing who has the right to manage valuable resources and how those resources can be used and exchanged. So think about property rights, for example. They define who owns what, how property can be transferred, and what happens if someone breaks those rules. This creates a framework for trust so we can invest in our homes, businesses, and ideas, knowing that our investments are protected.
So property rights are an institution. Huh. Sounds so basic. I never thought of it that way. But I can see how important that would be for building trust and helping the economy grow.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't know if your neighbor can just come and take your land, you probably wouldn't put much effort into making it better, right?
Exactly. And this trust goes beyond just being afraid of getting punished. Seabright tells the story about a taxi driver in India who found a wallet full of cash in his cab. He could have easily kept it, but instead he found the owner and gave it back.
That's amazing. It just shows that trust can exist even when there aren't strict laws to enforce it.
Exactly, and this is a really important point. Institutions aren't just about laws and rules, they're also about shared values, like what we think is right and wrong. This taxi driver returning the wallet wasn't just following some rule book, he was acting on a deeper sense of fairness and honesty, a belief that doing the right thing matters. These shared values are super important for institutions to work well.
That story really shows how trust is at the heart of it all. But it also makes me think about what happens when that trust breaks down, which brings us to something Seabright talks about that seems really relevant today: the impact of the Trump administration on public trust in institutions.
Right. This is where things get really interesting. President Trump often criticized existing institutions. He called them rigged or broken. This kind of talk, whether it's true or not, can have a big impact on how people see things.
So even if the institutions themselves are working fine, just the idea that they're not can be harmful.
Exactly. Remember, institutions depend on us believing in them. If enough people think the system is rigged, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. People lose faith, they stop participating, and the institutions get weaker.
That's a scary thought. So what happens when this loss of trust in institutions becomes really widespread?
Well, history gives us some serious warnings. The Great Depression, for example, was partly caused by a collapse of trust in the banking system. Bank runs panic, economic chaos. All of this was made worse by fear and distrust in the institutions that were supposed to keep things stable.
It's kind of terrifying that something as abstract as trust can have such real-world consequences. So how do we protect against this? How do we make sure our institutions stay strong and trustworthy?
That's a question we'll get into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore what makes institutions trustworthy and how we can work to strengthen them when they face challenges.
So when we left off, we were talking about how fragile institutions can be, like especially when people start to lose trust in them. That Great Depression example you gave is pretty intense.
It really shows you how important trust is for everything to work in society. You know, institutions aren't just these like abstract systems, they're a reflection of us, our values and how much we're willing to cooperate with each other.
Okay, I get that. But if institutions are built on trust,
Yeah.
how do we actually build that trust? I mean, trusting your neighbor or family is one thing, but how do you build trust in these massive systems that affect so many people?
hmm
People you'll probably never even meet, you know?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's something Seabright really tries to figure out in his book. He says there are a few key things that help build trust in institutions. One is transparency, when institutions are open and accountable, when you can see how decisions are made and resources are used. It's much easier to trust that they're doing what's best for everyone.
So instead of just being told, trust us, we know what we're doing, you can actually see how everything works for yourself, right?
Exactly. Think about how much more confident you'd feel getting on that airplane if you could see all the maintenance records, the pilot's training records, the safety procedures. Transparency makes you feel more confident, and it also makes it harder for corruption or abuse of power to happen without anyone noticing.
That makes a lot of sense. So the more open and accountable institutions are, the more trust they build. What else is there?
Another really important thing is fairness. When people feel like institutions are fair, that the rules are the same for everyone, they're more likely to trust the system even if they don't always get what they want.
So it's like even if you lose a game, you're okay with it if you believe the rules were fair and everyone had an equal chance to win.
Exactly. And it's not just about everyone being equal in the eyes of the law. It's also about making sure everyone has the same opportunities. A level playing field where everyone can succeed based on their own abilities, no matter where they come from. If people feel like the system is rigged against them from the start, they're not going to trust it.
Yeah, I can see how people would become resentful and cynical if they feel like they never had a fair shot. But how do we measure fairness? It seems like a pretty subjective thing.
It is complicated, but there are ways to figure it out. Things like social mobility, how easy it is for people to move up in society, and income inequality. How big the gap is between the rich and the poor are signs of fairness. If a society has high social mobility and low income inequality, it usually means the system is doing a pretty good job of giving everyone opportunities and rewards.
So you're saying that a society where people feel trapped in their social class and the gap between the rich and the poor keeps growing, it's probably not a society where people have much trust in institutions.
You got it. And that lack of trust can lead to all sorts of problems like social unrest, political instability, and even violence.
Okay, so transparency and fairness are super important for building trust. What else is there?
Well, there's one more thing that's absolutely crucial. Competence institutions have to actually work. They need to do what they're supposed to do, solve problems, and meet the needs of the people they serve.
So it's not enough to just look transparent and fair. You actually have to be good at what you do.
Exactly. If institutions keep failing, if they're seen as inefficient, bureaucratic, or corrupt, people will lose faith in their ability to function.
It's like you can have the coolest car in the world, but if the engine doesn't work, it's not going to take you anywhere.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where things get really interesting when we think about the Trump administration. Remember all those criticisms about institutions being broken or rigged?
Yeah, it felt like he was always saying that.
Right. And whether or not those criticisms were always true, they spoke to a feeling that a lot of people had a sense that the institutions that were supposed to help them were failing them.
So even if some of those criticisms were exaggerated or not based on facts, they still resonated with people who already felt like the system wasn't working for them.
Exactly. And that's why we need to be careful about how we talk about institutions. If we keep tearing them down, even if we have good reasons, we risk destroying the very foundation of our society.
It's like walking a tightrope. You have to hold institutions accountable for their mistakes without completely destroying people's faith in their ability to work.
You got it. And that's something we'll talk more about in the last part of our deep dive. We'll explore how institutions change and adapt over time and what we can do to make sure they change in ways that benefit everyone.
All right, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive on institutions. You know, I gotta say, this whole conversation has been kind of crazy. I started out thinking institutions were these like boring bureaucratic things, but now I see them as this super important foundation for our whole society built on this fragile thing called trust.
It's true, people often take institutions for granted, but they really are the invisible threads that hold everything together. And like we've been talking about, keeping that trust going is a constant challenge.
So where do we go from here? You said that institutions have to be able to change and adapt. How does that actually happen?
Well, the good news is that institutions aren't just stuck in time. They're always changing in response to new situations. Just think about how much institutions have changed in the last few decades, with the internet and globalization and all that.
Yeah, that's true. The way we communicate, do business, even how we get information, it's all so different now.
Right. And these changes have had a huge impact on institutions. We've seen brand new institutions pop up, like social media platforms, which have created totally new ways for people to connect with each other. And we've seen older institutions try to adapt, like governments and businesses trying to deal with the challenges and opportunities of this digital world.
So institutions are kind of like living things. They need to mutate and evolve to survive in a changing environment.
That's a great way to think about it. And this evolution can happen in a few different ways. Sometimes it's because of big crises like the 2008 financial crisis, for example, that exposed big problems in our financial institutions, which led to major changes to try to prevent things from collapsing again.
So sometimes it takes a huge shock to the system to make institutions change.
Yeah, it can be a really powerful push for change, but change can also happen gradually through lots of small reforms and adjustments over time. Like, think about how our views on things like marriage and family have changed and how our laws and social institutions have changed along with them.
So it's not always about these dramatic upheavals. Sometimes it's about slow and steady progress.
Exactly. And the important thing is that institutions are able to respond to the needs and wants of the people they're supposed to serve. If they become too rigid or resistant to change, they risk becoming irrelevant or even harmful.
Sounds like it's all about finding that sweet spot, stable enough to provide order and predictability, but also flexible enough to adapt to new things.
You nailed it. And this brings us right back to trust, because in the end, our ability to adapt and evolve as a society depends on our willingness to trust each other, to work together, and to believe that we can create a better future.
Okay, so trust is essential. But what can we as individuals do to help strengthen that trust in institutions? I mean, it all seems so huge and complicated. It's easy to feel like what we do doesn't really matter.
I know that's a common feeling, but it's just not true. Remember what we were saying earlier about those small acts of trust having a ripple effect every time you engage with institutions in a positive way, whether it's voting in an election, volunteering in your community, or even just speaking out against injustice. You're making that web of trust stronger.
So it's about showing up, participating, and holding institutions accountable, but in a way that helps make things better.
Exactly. And remember that taxi driver in India, he didn't set out to change the world. He just did what he thought was right in that moment. But that act of honesty and trustworthiness really meant something. It reminded us that even in this complicated world where we don't always know each other, individual acts of doing the right thing can make a difference.
That's a really inspiring thought. It reminds us that we all have a part to play in shaping the institutions that shape our lives.
Exactly. And while the problems we face might seem huge, they're not impossible to solve. By engaging with institutions in a thoughtful way, holding them accountable, and working to build a culture of trust, we can create a fairer, more just, and prosperous future for ourselves and for the generations that come after us.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about. This deep dive has been really eye-opening. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights.
It was great being here.
And to all of you listening out there, remember, you're not just sitting on the sidelines. You have the power to shape the institutions that shape your world. So go out there, get involved, and make your voice heard. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.